This is Ryan Bast of the Motor Safety Association. I'd like to welcome you to today's informational webinar on emergency response management. You may have noticed all the microphones are muted except mine, and they'll remain muted throughout the duration of this webinar. However, if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat box, and once the webinar concludes, I will look at all of the questions and send all the questions and answers to the attendees of today's webinar in a follow-up email. So if you have any questions as you go, please type them in the chat box. So let's get started. On today's agenda, I'll go over the concept of emergency operations as well as responsibilities. I'll talk about training requirements as well as inspection requirements for emergency response equipment. I'll discuss communications and notification in the event of an emergency. And I'll highlight various types of emergencies and leave you with some closing tips as well as some sample resources before we review and conclude today's webinar. So let's start off with this disclaimer. And today's webinar is designed to provide information on emergency response management. And I want people to know this webinar is not just about fires, but rather how to prepare and respond to various types of emergencies. And sometimes they believe fire is the only type of emergency at their facility they should be prepared for, but it is really only one of many. And the webinar today is meant to supplement your current emergency response program. You will still need to conduct routine emergency drills and practice emergency response scenarios. The basic concept for managing emergencies are broken into 4 elements: prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. And prevention focuses on if we can prevent it from happening in the first place, if at all possible. So eliminating that probability or likelihood of the disaster occurring. The preparedness focuses on if we can't prevent it, let's get ourselves ready and prepared by either making a kit or having a plan. So that again is just ensuring a good degree of readiness is available so that we are prepared in the event of an emergency. Then there's the response component. That's how we react to the incident to minimize damages or losses. And lastly is the recovery component, basically trying to restore or return the situation or environment to the pre-emergency state and normal operating conditions. So those are the 4 concepts of emergency operations. But as I talked about, I'll go through some of the responsibilities, starting with the employer. The employer's responsibilities include approving your emergency response policy and plan. Great idea for the employer to sign the policies and to demonstrate that commitment to the emergency response plan, and to ensure that employees are trained on the emergency response plan. This doesn't mean the employer needs to be the one that conducts the training, but needs to ensure that the employees that he or she, the employer, is responsible for has been trained in the response plan. And reviewing and improving the release of information to the press, media, or public. And I'll talk about that in our notification section on who should be speaking to the media in the event of an emergency. Other responsibilities ensure including resources are available to support emergency response management activities. So can we purchase the proper equipment and seek out the trainers to train our staff so they are prepared in emergency response. And looking at the likelihood or probability of various types of emergencies and ensuring that a plan or preparations are in place. Therefore, based on geographics, if there is no chance of a bear attack at your facility, you do not need to develop a response plan for bears at your location. But keep in mind looking at the big picture based on those geographics and situations. And I'll speak to that as well. Supervisor responsibilities. So in the event of an emergency or any type of evacuation, supervisor would do a head count of the information and record it. That'd be something the supervisor would be able to look after, as well as documenting and recording the emergency response events in a log. So if we did a drill, who was involved in it? How long did it take? How can we improve on that drill? It's all various things to include in the emergency log, as well as directing emergency services such as fire, police, ambulance at the scene of the emergency if they're looking for clarification. Safety committee responsibilities. Basically, safety committees are meant to be a check and balance of your emergency response management program and general safety activities for that matter. So the committee could review and improve the emergency response plan so they can take a look at it and send it off to approval for the employer to finalize and sign. They can ensure the emergency response training plan is provided to all employees, that they're aware of it, and that the plan has been tested through drills and exercises. So again, this doesn't mean that the committee is going to be the ones doing the training or conducting the drills. They are meant to be that check and balance to be ensured that training is provided and drills are conducted. And as an employee, the basic understanding of emergency response planning is critical. Employees need to participate. So if they were given training on fire extinguishers, and in the event of a small minor fire, it wouldn't be unreasonable to expect the employee to try to extinguish a small minor fire if it was safe to do so. Other responsibilities include CPR, shutting down of equipment in your area, so knowing where the power shutoffs are and emergency stops, being aware of the evacuation routes, and practicing basic spill control concepts. So keep in mind these are things that if these items are included in your emergency response program, that the employees are trained in these factors, and then it would be their responsibility to carry out that training. And when we look at training, you want to ensure that you review your training program to ensure that it meets the needs at the facility and it reflects any changes in hazards or conditions. So if the various circumstances or materials have entered your facility, the program may in fact need to be updated to reflect that. And keep in mind, training can be done through drills and exercises. And basically, when you do these types of things, always look to that continuous improvement and getting people involved and participating in them. Because it is a lot more of a relaxed setting to participate through a training scenario and be prepared, opposed to in the event of a real emergency and have not been prepared or have not received adequate training. So I know a lot of employers do great jobs of inspecting their facility, but when inspecting your facility, ensure that emergency equipment is also inspected at regular intervals. You need to ensure an effective response to emergency situations, so adequate quantities and types of equipment that are on site need to be inspected. If items were used, they need to be reordered, just so that you have the adequate resources available in the event of an emergency. But when you are conducting your facility inspections, look at your emergency response items. And each of these items are going to have recommended intervals for inspections. Some may be legislated, so depending on what jurisdiction, province, state, or country you're in, or set manufacturers intervals recommended by the manufacturer to conduct inspections within. So looking at fire extinguishers, I know nationally they need to be inspected in-house every month and then annually by an outside certifying agency. So those are inspections that need to be conducted to keep your emergency response equipment updated for fires. And then also there's checks that can be done for your automated external defibrillators, also known as an AED, eye wash stations, emergency backup lights, your alarm systems, smoke and CO2 detectors, emergency showers, fire blankets, and first aid kits. So these are items that you should also be included in your inspection program to ensure that they are being inspected as per legislated requirements, and in fact that they are available and up to date in the event that you need to use them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the communication aspect now. So what if there was a scenario or an emergent event that happened at your facility? And in order to have the release of confusing or misleading information, I strongly recommend having only designated individuals or authorized personnel speaking to the media. Generally, it's not one of the employees or frontline workers. It needs to be someone who has been trained to speak with the media and deal with these situations. Because what will happen is the media will keep poking a camera around there and look for that one disgruntled employee, and that'll be the face on the 6 o'clock news. That person will say, it was just a matter of time before we had a fire here. And they'll have your dealership sign in the background and that employee making that type of statement. And they think this is sometimes overlooked in emergency response planning. We sometimes maybe forget about the aftermath and the communication component and who's speaking to the media. And keeping in mind for these press statements, only accurate, substantiated information is to be released. Do not speculate. Do not attempt to place blame, and do not mislead. So the statement should include the nature and extent of the emergency, any response actions that were undertaken, the impact on or off the site areas, and the coordination with site officials, which officials you are working with. You're going to also want to monitor access to the facility so that the press and the public are entering the facility. You may even have to bring in a security company to monitor and ensure that that area is prohibited from people entering that should not be there. So keep these items in mind when it comes to communications. When it comes to notifications, each facility should have their own method of notification. And it depends on what you've been trained on at your facility. You may in fact be using an intercom system, an air horn, a pager. There may be a pull station with an alarm built into it, a separate alarm. It could be the telephone, group email, group text message. Any type of notification that you have put into place or your employer has taught you on is the one that you're going to use. Don't just decide that, oh, it looks like there's an emergent situation, I'm going to send a text message out to some people. This needs to be communicated and planned in advance on how you're going to be notifying people in the event of an emergency. And be sure to use the method as taught by your employer. In the upcoming slides, I'm going to highlight various types of emergencies that you're likely going to want to include in your emergency response plan if it's applicable. And I'm going to kick it off with CPR and first aid. So if an employee is trained in CPR and first aid and their training is current, they need to follow the standard protocols for those types of situations. They want to ensure the scene is safe and identifying any of those hazards before entering an area, because they do not need to become a casualty themselves. And some time ago, when I took my first responder training, one of the very, very first things I learned was scene safety. Do not attempt a rescue unless you know that the scene is safe for rescuers to enter. So generally, CPR and first aid is something that is included in emergency response plans at all facilities. If an employee feels that the situation is serious enough to immediately warrant an ambulance, they should dial 911 or have a bystander phone in and request an ambulance. And if you do that, be sure to tell that bystander, once you call 911, please come back to me to confirm. That way I know help is on its way. Because sometimes people may panic. They may be afraid to call 911 and they may in fact take off and get away from the situation in the event of a bystander. They might not want to get involved. So if that bystander doesn't come back to you, get somebody else. I need you to call in 911 and come back to me. And this, in fact, will let you know that resources are on their way. The next item to discuss is fire. And if an employee cites a minor fire, they should activate their notification system announcing, "We have a minor fire at this location," and repeat it at least once. But, and I emphasize this, if it is safe to do so, and only if it is safe to do so, if you are trained in fire extinguisher usage and you have the correct type of fire extinguisher available, then you may attempt to try to extinguish the fire. Don't just grab a water-based fire extinguisher, compressed water, into the electrical room for a fire. So you need to, in fact, know and be trained on extinguisher usage in the event of a fire before trying to attempt to extinguish it. And if at any time that you feel that you're not able to extinguish the fire with your extinguisher, immediately evacuate. Because a small fire can lead into a major fire, and in that situation, immediately leave the building. As you're leaving the building, activate your notification system, either en route if it's a pull station as you're going past it, or when it's safe to do so, have that notification system dispatched for people to know that there is a major fire at their facility. So that's something that is unfortunately too common. We have way too many fires every year. Also, the probability of explosion may be something you want to consider in your emergency response plan. When an employee becomes aware of a major explosion, they should immediately activate their notification system, initiating a shutdown and evacuation, announcing, "We've had an explosion at this location," and repeat the message at least once. Generally, there's 4 probable types of explosions, whether it be chemical, natural gas, nitrogen, or propane. And when we look at explosion, it could really lead to structural damage. And the structural damage is a major structural failure. And if it's serious enough, this could also cause many secondary problems, such as fires, explosions further to that, electrical damage, or even water damages. So using your notification system, announce, "We've had a major structural failure at this location," shut down and evacuate the building, and repeat that message. And once you've heard that type of message of the major structural damage, the emergency response team will, unless unsafe to do so, they will turn off the power to that area, turn off the water, and exit the building. If it isn't safe, they aren't going to do those things, but they're going to try to generally turn off the power and water just to ensure that it doesn't create secondary problems. A power outage is a component that you can have in your emergency response program. Keep in mind the loss of power is generally short in duration. Generally, you don't get power out for days on end. Sometimes it's in short periods, but it can be out for days on end depending on your area where you're at and depending on how severe the problem is. Keep in mind costs associated with power loss can be huge for a business to absorb. If the power failure lasts more than a few moments, the employee should begin to inquire to check into the situation, checking their breaker panel box. So if they are knowledgeable on the electrical layout of your facility, they should first check to see if that problem is internal. And if it's deemed to be an external problem, if you're in Saskatchewan, you'd contact Sask Power. And if you're in a other state or province, you would contact your power agency that supplies you with power if it's deemed to be an external problem. What about a loss of water supply? If a water line fails, water is going to be squirting everywhere and causing a huge mess. So you're going to want to attempt to isolate that line by shutting off the water valve nearest to that break. If you cannot locate the nearest valve, you may have to shut off the water main and turn off all water at the facility. And keep in mind that this can lead, water spraying can lead to other secondary problems. If it's focusing in on electrical problems, it can hit flooding, damage to equipment. Water damage is huge. And once the water has been shut off and the power, a plumbing contractor can repair the line, and a cleaning crew could be used to tidy up the water damages that occurred at your facility. So be prepared for the loss of water supply. Sewer backup. Once an employee discovers that there's a sewer backup, they should immediately discontinue the use of that drain. They can attempt to trace the drain line back and follow it to determine if it's an internal problem or if it's a problem of the town, city, or village in that area. So if it's an in-house problem, you may have to contact a plumber or a Roto-Rooter. If it's a external problem, again, contacting that city, town, or village that is in that jurisdiction. And for your benefit, you may have noticed I had pictures on most of the slides. I did not put a picture in of a sewer backup for you folks today. All right, let's talk about tornadoes. And the severe weathers for a tornado is something to be aware of. Tornado seasons generally in the summer, but actually we had a major tornado here in the Ontario, Quebec area just within this month of September alone. And it was quite serious. But if any employee hears of a tornado warning, they should contact the supervisor, who will ensure that the weather is checked frequently and it's followed up on. So if conditions are favorable for weather and permitting the possibility of a tornado, the employees will be notified of the possibility of a tornado, and the supervisor will follow up to ensure that by checking with the weather conditions to see what if it progresses or does not progress. But if an advancing tornado is spotted and the employee notifies or sees this tornado, he can notify their activation system saying, we have a tornado approaching. Shut down and go to the designated area and repeat that information. So your designated area may be a basement or tornado shelter at your facility. Again, these are all things to prepare for in advance of a tornado. Not when a tornado is en route to your facility. Preparing for the tornado in advance was what the best practice is for your emergency response plan. The other severe weather to consider, especially here in central Canada, are extreme weather situations such as blizzards, very strong snowstorms. And if the blizzard is severe enough, the employee should avoid leaving the facility, because a severe winter storm is unlikely to cause an in-house emergency. So if you have to stay at your facility, you could stay there and wait out the storm. If the power goes out, that could be a different situation, because now we're going to have a loss of heat. But generally, if you stay at the facility until the storm passes, is the best practice. Because being caught in a cold, severe winter storm can be very deadly. And it also focuses responders and rescuers to look for you, which puts more people at risk. So don't be caught in one of those situations. Stay at the facility until conditions are safe for travel. And in some situations, too, employers may have came up with a system of we are going to send people home early if they know that a storm is likely coming mid to late afternoon. They may send everybody home at noon hour that day. So again, whatever policy and how that works at your facility can be adapted within this program. After the snowstorm or blizzard, what if there was a substantial amount of snow? At that point, you should have an authorized personnel or contractor check your roof to ensure that it's not going to collapse if you had a huge accumulation of snow. Also, someone at your facility should check your exits and your means of egress points to ensure that people can exit the facility and that the snow is not compromising the integrity of the building or the functionality of the entrance and exit points. What about a bomb threat? If a bomb threat is called into your location, the operator or reception person who received that call should make every possible effort to keep that caller on the line as long as possible. So train reception in this and people who frequently answer phones at your facility. The operator should ask the who, where, when, why, what time type of questions. They should note voice and speech peculiarities and any telltale sounds that may suggest the place where that call is coming from. The caller may even tell you the general location of the bomb or the approximate time it's due to explode at. Keep in mind, most bomb threats are no more than threats, but don't be complacent. Be prepared for a bomb in your emergency response plan for a bomb threat. Anybody ever come across any violent situations at your facility? So you may have a violent customer or violent employee. Do not antagonize the situation or try to make it worse. You want to try to diffuse the situation because an angry customer can become violent very quickly. Perhaps involving a manager or supervisor to speak with the violent individual can de-escalate the situation. So the violent person may feel somewhat better if you say, I'm going to refer this to my manager. He or she could talk to you about this a little better than I can. And then the customer or employee, depending on the situation, will feel that they're being heard, and that person, manager, supervisor, can hopefully de-escalate that situation. And if all else fails, activate your sprinklers, pull your notification system for evacuation. Anything to create a diversion will interrupt the scene until other resources can be activated. So these are just some tips that are some different items I've talked about that you can include in your emergency response plan. I will be sending everybody a manual after the webinar, which will cover these in detail and give you, as well as other possible emergent situations to prepare for. But I want to leave you with some closing tips. And I want you to plan for a wide variety of emergencies. Your plan needs to be about more than just fires. And look at other probable emergencies at your locations. What about different hazardous situations? Do you work with combustible dust? Did we introduce new chemicals into our workplace? Flammable liquids? What happens if these liquids mix with each other? Are these things that we've been trained on through WMIS to handle and understand? Do I have compressed cylinders? Again, just focus and take a look around your facility for various types of emergent situations and plan for these types of emergencies. Another closing tip is know your role within the plan. So if you have a key role, know it and practice it. So if your role is to close the fire doors behind you on your way out, or to grab the log with the employees' names on and document the plan or document the evacuation and head count, or if you're responsible for ensuring the safety of a deaf worker, that they're notified because they may not even be aware of the emergency. So know your role, practice it, and understand it so that you are ready in the event of an emergency. Include contractors in your emergency planning. If your business regularly has contractors on site, and most businesses do at some point or another have contractors coming in, these people should be included in your emergency response plan. Train the contractors, give them a copy of your plan. If they're on site, they need to be involved in the drill for your program. So getting contractors involved is critical. If you are interested in contractor safety, we do have more information on our website. We did a webinar on contractors, so feel free to follow on that because contractor management is really a hot topic also. And again, including the needs of disabled workers or customers. I spoke of the person that may be deaf, but workers or customers with disabilities, sometimes they may not even be aware this situation is unfolding, or they may have trouble evacuating, and they may need assistance to evacuate. So you need to have a good path or means of egress for these people to exit the facility. And this can be part of your inspection process or your plans or your routine drills, is assessing the workplace. Are there potential barriers for disabled workers or customers prior to an emergency? So prior to the emergency, I'm assessing the situation, ensuring that I've got good paths and means of egress. My exits aren't bolted or jammed. Sometimes we have ground shifting and the doors don't open properly. Maybe some exits I can't get a wheelchair through. So these are all things that we need to look at before emergency occurs. And what helps you find those exits are making sure that they are backlit. So as you see in the picture, there's an exit sign here, and that exit sign should be hardwired in at your facility, backlit so that it's illuminated and clearly visible. And I really like this type of design. It has the emergency backup lights built into it. So in the event of a power outage, those lights will kick in and direct you to the exits, and it'll allow you to see a path to get to there. So these are things that you should have at your facility. This should be part of your monthly inspection routine to inspect the emergency exit and backup lighting to make sure that they are illuminated and working. And again, making sure those exits open freely, because as I said, sometimes they're jammed shut or they aren't available to open if there's shifting and they may not be able to get through them. So look at these tips in advance. Coordinate your planning with local authorities. So in the event of an emergency, police, fire, EMS, first responders, any of these types of groups may be called out. So why not involve them in your emergency planning? Get them to review your emergency plan. And in some communities, these folks will even come out and assist you with your plan and provide guidance and direction when it comes to your emergency response plan and provide important feedback. So this is a group that should be involved in the process. They should be given a copy of your plan. And again, this will increase the likelihood of a successful response. And I know locally here, the fire department within the city of Regina, they occasionally do visits. So we actually experienced a visit. They came to our facility. They checked to see if we had our evacuation plan posted, if our extinguishers were available, up to date, inspected, correct signage. They wanted to check our exits, that if they were backlit, and if our furnace room, any combustible materials around it. So it's great when these types of emergency services participate and come out and offer their mentorship in emergency planning. Also, practice your drill and revise the plan as needed. The plan that I will email you today does zero good unless you roll it out, make it your own, and practice it. And keep in mind yearly revisions. Don't just shelf it. Look at your plan at least annually. You may have to look at it sooner if there's different things introduced into your facility. And when you are conducting those practice drills, what are weak spots in the plan? Are the roles clarified properly? If we found a weak spot, how can we correct it and communicate those changes within our plan? If we don't do this, that situation isn't going to fix itself. We've missed an opportunity to implement corrective action. Practice makes perfect. Don't wait for a fire to have your first fire drill. Another closing tip is planning for the impact of emergencies on business operations. And this focuses on the aftermath. And I think this is an area that people miss too often. So they may in fact go through the plan and have some great ideas on how we can respond and evacuate properly. But how do we continue business after the fact? So if our facility or location burnt down, do we have a business continuity plan? Because otherwise, it's business not as usual. What if, in the event of a severe incident, OHS conducted a stop work order at our facility? Or if we had severe damage that we had to do a rebuild, how could a business survive that? What do we need to do to get through this? What kind of resources are needed? Do I need to bring in temporary tents, portable trailers? Perhaps the local rink may let me set up in there for the time being. Do I have my data and IT backed up to a server off-site? So how do we continue aftermath? And this is actually, I talked to a facility just last week. They had a fire at their location in July, and they are still dealing with this stuff right now. People are working in tents in the parking lot, and the seasons are changing, so that's not comfortable. They're looking at getting replacement tools in place, the paperwork. They've tried to involve outside suppliers to assist them. But again, I just want to reiterate this point that plan for impact of emergencies on your business so that you can prepare for that if something were to ever happen at your facility. A couple other resources I'd like to tell you about: the Canadian Centre of Occupational Health and Safety, the CCOHS, has some great resources on their website. They have an emergency response planning manual, guides, and templates. So I encourage you to go to that website, ccohs.ca, and to take advantage of those free resources. Also, the Government of Canada has a Get Prepared program, which they provide publications to help you know about the risks and to make a plan and develop a kit. So they've got some great situations and great resources that you can use to be prepared in those types of situations. So take advantage of those also from those websites. And at the end of today's webinar, all the attendees today will receive the emergency planning manual as promised. And I've got some other publications and sample templates you'll also receive from me. And you'll also receive in a separate email the webinar certificate template. So the template will come, and it's a Word document. You can type your name into that document, print it off, and save it for your records. And you'll also receive a short survey after the webinar, which is used to help us look at future topics and provide for feedback on how we can make these webinars the best possible experience for the attendees. As we are always welcoming future suggested topics for our quarterly webinars. And on that note, that concludes our webinar on emergency response management. And I'm going to leave the webinar open here for another minute or two, just to allow you, if you have any questions that you want to type into the chat box or question box, to do so at this time. If you wish to talk offline, you can contact me at the phone number provided or at the email address. We also have a website with other resources and free information, as well as a Twitter handle also if you're on Twitter. So feel free to look at any of those other venues of contact if you wish. But at this point, I'd like to thank you for joining me today on the webinar on emergency response management.